Prime Minister, Mayor, Bishops, distinguished guests, dear all. It's a great honor for me to welcome you to University of Bergen and to the Universitetsaulaen for this Luther conversation. My name is Lise Fimreite. I'm Deputy Rector here at the University. And before I say anything else, I need to do my duty as your host and give you the security instructions. In case of an emergency, if you need to evacuate this hall, there is a security exit at the long side of the room. There is also 2 exits in the back of the room. And we have to move calmly outside and in an orderly fashion. And we have to gather together outside, outside the statue in front of the museum. And if you should need toilets, it's in the very bottom of the building. You have to go down 2 floors to the toilets. There is no toilets in this floor. And then I can go back to my little speech. The University of Bergen is very proud to be part of the celebration that marks the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Bergen is designated as Norway's Reformation city, and it's part of a major European anniversary network. UIB participates with several contributions during this festival. When Martin Luther, in October 1517, nailed his 85 theses to the church door in Wittenberg and invited to academic disputation, he triggered an avalanche of events that in a few years dramatically transformed the religious and political landscape in Europe. The Norwegian society has also been deeply marked by the legacy of Martin Luther, and we still is today. At the present time, society showed ability to adapt rather quickly to the changes and the challenges that the Reformation brought forward. Not without conflicts, one can even add, not without wars. Today's society also faces changes and challenges, and we feel that the changes are faster than ever. How to handle and how to cope with great societal challenges like migration, climate changes, poverty, health, security. What is the role of religion in our societies, near us and further away? The Reformation was inspired and even triggered by new technologies. Today, we can hardly open a newspaper without reading about digitalization and what that will mean to all of us now. Maybe today's society can learn something from the history and from how societies past have handled their challenges. I look forward to hear more about these themes and others during this conversation. Again, a very warm welcome to the university. And then I will invite Bishop Helga Byfuglien to the floor, please.
and all of us looking forward to this conversation. It is also my duty and also my pleasure to give thanks to the University of Bergen for this cooperation. I think this panel taking place here will give us very important perspectives, and to being situated in this wonderful hall, I think the circumstances are the best for a very good afternoon here. So it is also my pleasure and my joy to give the floor to the moderator of the conversation, the not less famous Bergenser, Wilhelm Steinfeld, please.
Thank you. When the panel will take their seats, I will start in this very sinister audience to crack a joke. It's a good joke, and it says something about the way our priests developed in Western Norway. And this was in Leikanger in Sogn, where there was a very practical priest. His name was Dor. And after the sermon on Sunday, he was simply attending the fields. And one of the strong women's in the missionary movement of the hamlet passed on the road, commenting on the priests working on Sunday in the field. And she reminded him that it was Sunday and he's continued to work on the field. And then the lady pointed to the heaven and she said, "The Lord himself see you." Whereas the priest commented, "He may see me, but he doesn't run around in the hamlet gossiping about it." Dear audience, dear panel, our mandate today is the Luther Conversation, Prescription for a Society Under Pressure. Norway was under a huge pressure 500 years ago, a Danish landscape merely. The Lutheran faith was imposed on Norway by King Christian III without a popular movement in support of this way of religious belief here in this country. Distance to authorities had alienated the population and led to anarchism, not least in Western Norway. The struggle for survival made people self-sufficient versus the king and the Pope. At least this continued for 400 years, what the national romantics of this country called the 400 years night under Danish rule. Protestantism won our souls and minds because it gave advice both for physical survival as well as a road to salvation. But today, the state and the Church of Norway has been separated, if not divorced, during the rule of Her Excellency Prime Minister Erna Solberg. I have the honor to give you the word.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the University of Bergen and the Church for facilitating this discussion on a very wide issue, I believe. Well, I'm looking forward to see what points different participants are making. But I'd like to thank you also for challenging us and to lead the panel. I would like to make three opening sort of remarks on this. Yes, I'll take the responsibility for administrating the separation of church and state, but the decision was made earlier under the previous government, but by a very, very large majority in Parliament. And we had, in fact, two very different but important changes that we're working on 8 years ago. One of them was the separation of church and state. The second was a topic that had been discussed for a long time. What should be the formålsparagraf, the mandates, the basic mandates for schools and kindergartens. And I'm taking these things because through that period we had a good discussion What's the value basis of the Norwegian society? Which type of values should we transport to our educational system, to the kindergartens and the schools? What are these basis values, and how can we build on that also in the separation of church and state? That's why we, even if we have separated the church and state, which I think is good, I am personally been in favor of that for a long, long time, because I think it's not a right answer in a more multicultural society, but it's also because I think that the church needed to be freed from the state, which was my principal view when I was 14 years old, and I've kept it. It's because I thought politicians meddled too much into the church affairs. I still believe the separation is important. I think it's an answer in our society, but that does not mean that we should not still continue to work on the basis of our society. And that's why, even if we changed the relationship between state and church, we did have amendments to our constitution. Thank you. Our constitution on the value basis of the Norwegian society, and that's why we also have a special arrangement in our constitution for the church today. I think our society, both the church and the state, is best served by being separated. That's my one point. On issues I think it's important to discuss also is, because this interlinks with the situation where we are becoming more multicultural, more people living with different religions and bases, I think the church has a very important role in that type of work in our society. I believe that the church role is to build also bridges, because the Norwegian church is such a big congregation in Norway. It has a special role in building bridges towards the other religious congregations in our society. I think there's a challenge. I think in our society today, the debate is even more between those who are believing and those who are not believing than it's between what you are believing in, which type of religion you have. I think religious thinking and people who would live by their religious feelings is more challenged by all of those who do not believe and how they think the society should be. So I think it's an important part to bridge between the different, to make sure that the freedom of religion means also the freedom to believe, in fact, in our societies. And I think, but it's also because to build bridges against extremism, build bridges for inclusion in the society and acceptance, and to understand that a lot of those values that we say are core Norwegian values, yes, they come from a religious background, a Christian humanitarian background, but they are not solely based, it's not just that religious background that has that type of ideas that we would like to build them. I think it's extremely important that the church helps us to build societies that are not based on us and them thinking. Even if there is difference between the religions, I think that's an important role for the church. And I also think that the church is a great arena for integration. A lot of those people who come to our country come from much more active religious societies. They come with different religion background, but there's a lot of Christians who is coming to it. And I think that having very good integrational platform in the church is important for the society at whole. And in a more changing society, there is a stability that the church can lead to our society, but it has to be inclusive for new groups and new people. And I think I'll just look forward to hearing what the other participants are saying.
Thank you very much. We will return during the discussion, definitely, to one of the cores of your statements. Now, however, the Bishop of Bergen, Halvor Nordhaug, you co-signed the book. In my feeble translation into English, the book was called How Christian Can Norway Be? And indeed, Your Excellency, should Norway remain, and can Norway remain Christian to the same extent after the separation between the state and the church?
First, I must say I'm not used to being called Excellency, but
in Bergen, we are very polite people.
Yeah, very polite. Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Well, this book that I wrote together with my friend Henrik Syse, we had a common concern. And I think our concern was online with what the Prime Minister just said, that we wanted to show that the Christian heritage in Norway has in many ways formed our society and our way of thinking, our values, the way we live together, and not least our law system. And in the first chapter in that book, I tried to show how the Christianity had a big influence on the laws of Norway and how human rights was gradually built in to the laws that we had here in our country. And I show that by one example. Before Christianity came, it was legally all right to put children out to die. If you didn't want the children, you could put them out in the forest to die. And this was then not legal when Christianity arrived in Norway, and it was gradually tighter and tighter. And at the end, if you put a child to death, you were lawless and you were an outcast of society. A very severe punishment, which shows in just one way how Christianity changed the way we were thinking about human rights, and especially the rights for the weakest, the children. And if we follow the history of Norway, it's easy to see how Christianity made this society into a more human society with a better situation for children, for women, and after some times also for the slaves. On the other hand, the history of Christianity and state church in Norway also, must admit, is a history of oppression. The church was not always in the first line when it came to equality between women and men, for instance. And there are many examples that the church was not always the best keeper of the Christian heritage, that other movements, for instance, the labor movement and the movement for women liberation, took better care of the Christian heritage than the church did. We have to admit that. But on the whole, I think it's safe to say that our society is fundamentally marked by Christianity. And for the most, it has been a great blessing. And now that church and state are divided, it was on high time, by the way, it is our duty as a church to build this society on the same foundation that we have already stated in the Constitution, a Christian and humanistic heritage. And I think this is an obligation that we share with the state. We want to build such a society. And that also means for the church to keep an eye on how the state does its policy. And there are some controversies, for instance, when it comes to climate change, oil policy, and the policy over refugees and asylum seekers. We have put some criticism on the former government and on this government. And it's not always appreciated. But that's the way it has to be, I think.
Thank you, Bishop. From Germany and Hanover, we are honored by the presence of Dr. Juris Stephanie Springer. With two predominant religions in Germany, Catholicism and Protestantism, your country has healed after a 50 years division. The last 28 years you have been doing this after the downfall of the Berlin Wall. What role did Lutheran churches in Germany play fighting the totalitarian rule in our newest history of Europe?
Thank you. Please let me first, because we were talking about here fresh separation as a church in a country that is not having its Reformation anniversary this year, but celebrates separation as centennial in 2 years. Bring my congratulations, if I may. So after the first 40, 50 bumpy years, we are getting on really well with it, and we are quite happy. And I think this separation and the role might have be something to do with how we treated that question. You asked me the role of Christians during the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, as you know, in that regime, SED regime, there wasn't any open political debate or discussion, but in the end of the 80s, opposition was forming, and probably some could guess that in the late 80s, the SED party would probably loosen its grip on its population by opening perhaps borders to travel, but actually nobody knew exactly what would happen, that the people took its power by itself and not the state, and that they didn't tear the wall down, but the whole state. And what is the most important thing, that was a peaceful movement. And I think indeed that Protestantism had a relevant contribution to that peaceful development in it, because more perhaps than the institutional church, but the ministers, the congregations and Christian individuals, they offered a form of platform, a roof in their churches to open debate, to opposition. And that was one thing. Perhaps you know the famous peace prayers in Leipzig in the church, and the demonstrations, the real Monday demonstrations in Leipzig, where there was the possibility to form a movement, to be together. And this, I think, was decisive. Another thing was decisive because of the institutional, of the synods, because the synods were a role model for democratic life. There was a possibility to learn, to share arguments, to debate, and how revolutionary to elect a bishop. I think that was a symbol, was seen as a political symbol. If you ask me for the churches as institution, well, that is always not black and white, perhaps a gray zone, because as an institution, church in the GDR had to cooperate in a way with the state, with a secret service, and you know the way between cooperation and collaboration is always a bit a slippery slope, and they were quite criticized. I think some of the churches were more reluctant, some of them were more open, but in the end, institutional church let Christians do what they did. So that was a contribution as well, even if they had to go on in this system. What was a shame is that after this success, I would say, that hadn't a missionary effect after the fall of the wall. If there was one success of the communism, that was the decreed atheism, and even after that, people left church, working in politics rather than in church, and so we really have a downfall in percentage of church membership in Eastern Germany, even if we have this wonderful memory. Perhaps I leave it at that point.
Angela Merkel is the daughter of a priest.
Exactly. And our President Gauck was a minister, active, who had an active role in that time, yes.
We will not rest with Europe. Our next key speaker is Professor Robert Woodbury from the United States. In this country, many people have read a novel. It was called The Land God Gave Cain. It's about St. Lawrence Bay in Canada, a country today given refuge for people from the third world against Donald Trump. You have been dedicating a lot of research on the effect of missionaries in the third world. You have even called, in a positive, symbolic sense, the effect of those efforts like an atomic bomb.
When we're talking about the impact of Protestantism in a place like Norway or in Europe, it's difficult to know how much was caused by Protestantism and how much was caused by Scandinavian culture or some other factor. So part of how I do that is, one, look at historical patterns that developed in Europe with the Reformation and the effect here, but then looking at the Protestant and Catholic missionary movement and seeing what effect they had around the world, and seeing when the patterns are common and when they're not. Because nothing is caused by just one thing. But what we see is, when we see where Protestant missionaries went, there's a lot of the same effects that they had in Northwest Europe that make Northwest Europe different from other parts of Europe. They spread mass education. They spread mass printing and newspapers. They spread voluntary associations. And that empowered people both economically and politically. And it had long-term effects both on the economy and on the political system. So when I say it's like an atomic bomb, we can measure the effect that missionaries had, and we can compare it with other theories of how you get democracy or how you get economic development. And what you find, even in very, very careful modeling, the effect of Protestant missions is huge. And it removes the effect of many other factors that people have been writing and researching about for 50 years, about the roots of democracy or the roots of economic development. And you can see that actually Protestantism had a huge influence on outcomes that we often attribute to other mechanisms, even if people didn't convert. So Protestant missionaries, when they went, they opened schools, which challenged other people to open schools in order to compete. They started translating the Bible into the local language, creating a written language if none existed, but either starting printing for the first time or expanding printing into a mass technology if it already existed. That challenged other people also to print. They created voluntary associations. They modeled how to do nonviolent pressure in terms of organizing things and pressuring for change. Then other people copied them and they used them for their own purposes. So then it wasn't just Protestants who were pressuring for democracy or for independence from colonial rule. It was other groups, but they were shaped by these things that Protestants initiated. And you can see the pattern of that all around the world very strongly.
Last but not least, we have Professor Einar Thomassen of the history of religion at the University of Bergen. Rome is not an actual part, and this is also said with humor in this discussion, but when people are going to be beatified in Rome, they always appoint the advocate of the devil to cast critical light on the topic at issue. I don't know, Anna, we are old mates from grammar school. I don't know if you feel the calling of being the advocate of the devil. But more than 200 years ago, Hans Nielsen Hauge saw God as he stood on acred land and taught Norwegians the importance of growing potatoes. Famine was a threat. How do you assess Lutheranism historically in Norway? Was it a bred religion as well as a true road to salvation?
Thank you, Hans. I'm not sure how comfortable I am with the role of the devil's advocate, but of course the devil is very relevant when we're talking about Luther, because he was consorting with the devil in some way or another every day, which you can see from his writings. Anyway, This is question you've been asking me is a type of historical question which I should be somehow qualified to give an answer to. And now, the short version of the story of Lutheranism in Norway, as I see it, is that what Lutheranism was not introduced from below in Norway. Everybody agrees that there was no popular movement. There were no Norwegian peasants that were clamoring to hear the gospel being preached to them. Instead, it all came from above. It was a decision by the Danish-Norwegian king, who had already introduced Protestantism in his own county when he was of Holstein, and now wanted to do the same in Denmark, Norway. And so the people had absolutely no say in this matter. So what we got Protestantism gave us in the first place was absolute monarchy, and a monarchy which became more and more absolute during the 16th and the 17th centuries. And in some way, that type of Lutheranism from above was intensified in the 18th century when you got a more firmly established school system, and you got the confirmation. Everybody, all school children had to learn the catechism, and they had to learn the stories of the Bible. And so this was a sort of a second level of Lutheranization of Norway. In other words, a strong campaign of religious indoctrination. Now, the paradoxical result of this is that this process of indoctrination internalized Lutheranism much more in the minds and the hearts of the population than it had done before. And so, on that basis, it created, in the next generation, various popular movements that felt empowered by learning about Lutheranism and having sort of emotionally formed an attachment to the Protestant doctrines from childhood. And so that created the basis of what we have as the movement of Hans Nielsen Hauge, for instance, and which became sort of a prototype for later popular movements in Norway. So when you talk about bread or religion, I think the main factor is the effect of empowerment that came out of the second Lutheran Reformation process in the 18th century. That empowerment expressed itself both in independent and religious movements critical of the church, but also in the form of independent economic activities. So these two things go together and are expressions of the same type of effects that came out of what I have now called the Lutheran indoctrination in the 18th century.
We shall speak more about the past. However, we must also face today's challenges. And Mrs. Prime Minister, you applied the notion of multiculturalism. This year, during the World Economic Forum in Davos, the founder of the whole forum, Professor Klaus Schwarz, stated that on the agenda, one of the central parts this year was the establishing of identity. My question to you all, I would like to take a round on that. Is Christianity still an important carrier of the European identity, if we also keep the broader cultural spectre in mind? Mrs. Prime Minister, you first.
Yes, I think so. I think that Christianity is still, or Christian values, is still a core of the European identity.
Even morale?
Even morale, it depends on what you mean with that. That's the more difficult. But the values, the fact that you as a person has your own responsibility, you have your own relationship to God, the individual, putting the individual responsibilities and obligations into the focus, I think that's basis. It's also basis of course, of the human rights that you are seeing the individual, not the system, not the even if it's a political or religious system. But I think, and I think it's important that we are firm in our beliefs on those values that have formed our societies, but they will always develop. The question when you come to a multicultural society, which I don't like the world, but it's because it sometimes gives the notion that you are living in separate cultures in the same country and you are living by your own rules and regulations. I don't believe in that. I have always believed in integration. I believe that when you are becoming people with different identities meet together, you will form a new type of identity together. And it's not two different cultures or multicultures. It's a new synergy culture that will arise from this. And that's why I don't really like the multiculturalism discussion, because for those of us who work politically on integration policies, that means that you are, in fact, accepting that people should live in our society by the rules of the society they come from. I don't do that. I believe that, of course, you live by a religion, but I believe all women who are in this country have the same rights. And you might say that women got better with Christianity. I'm not sure. Viking women had better heritage rules, better position. You know the biggest downturn for Norwegian women were? They were in 1160 when the Norwegian civil wars, when the church decided that the first son of the first white-born son in marriage should be the king of Norway. It took away all women's heritage rights and ownership rights in our society. So I'll just give a small comment on the church misgivings towards women sometimes.
Bishop Nordhaug, you are already pressed by a woman here. I will add to the pressure along the same question that you will all comment on and ask you simply, is the influx of immigrants now and refugees a factor setting Norwegian values, hereunder also Christian values, under pressure in the Norwegian society?
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question, that our confession to the human and Christian heritage is put on test when it comes to certain political issues. I will first mention one other issue, which is euthanasia, the possibility to take one's own life because of suffering. This is on the political agenda. And this will be a test case for how strong the Christian values are in our political system and in our parliament. And your question concerning refugees and asylum seekers, it's obvious that the church has to speak out for the rights that are secured in international law for people who are fleeing from death and persecution. And we strongly disagree in many points with this government when it comes to how this problem is solved. We think that the grip is too hard. On the other hand, we acknowledge that, of course, not all who are refugees can be taken up in Norway. And we acknowledge also that this is a very complicated question, because it's not only a question of coming to Norway, but also of integration and receiving this on a dignified way. But in general, I think the church is obliged to speak out for human rights, especially when it comes to concerns like asylum seekers and refugees.
Professor Robert Woodbury, the US society always took pride being a melting pot of both religions and ethnical groups. What do you think about the European ability to living ourselves together in one culture that you, to some extent, succeeded in doing in the United States?
Well, in the United States, it was and is been a complicated process. We haven't always been good at it. It's been a struggle. There has been discrimination against Catholics, against indigenous people. There's been tensions with various immigration movements. And over time, we've worked out patterns. Now, I think we have a reversion in our current government, which I'm not a fan of. But there's always a struggle between groups that are more established and more powerful and other groups. There just always is. And there's always a struggle when you have people with different languages and different cultures and different religions coming out to a compromise in how to live together. And it will be always a struggle. I think it'll be a little bit harder in Europe because there is sort of an ethnic foundation or association with most nation states in Europe. Whereas because of the immigrant character of United States and North American countries, there's always been this process of integrating various different groups which were not sort of linked to one ethnicity, although it became racialized in terms of white people being dominant. And that's been a struggle for us in terms of integrating people of different racial groups in the United States, which has been a struggle for us. And I think we've gotten better at it over time, but that doesn't mean it's still not a struggle.
Stephanie Springer, Southern Europe is Roman Catholic, Northern Europe is Protestant. You have both religions in Germany. How did you succeed? And where is, above all, the German identity today?
I think at least 10 questions at one time.
Life is not meant to be easy.
Gives me the possibility to choose what I want. Well, I would like to link that to the refugee question you posed to identity, and where Catholic and Protestant church was about 50-50 in Germany. We have 21 million Catholics and 20 million Protestants all over Germany, even if there is a north-south gap. And we are quite unified in how we see the refugee problem today. As a Christian test, and we are strongly working to make that work, as Angela Merkel said. Wir schaffen das, the Obama German, yes we can. And that is a strong story of cooperation, of state on the one side and the two big churches on the other side. And the art is not to appear as a hyper-moralist, as a know-it-all, but as somebody who helps and who shows how the ideal of the Samaritan could be realized in a world full of faults and of humans. And we try to do a trifold job together with the Catholic partners. We do help to refugee programs. Our parishes, congregations are doing that themselves, and we're giving them money. But we do two other things. We try to influence politics towards a European solution, finding a European solution. And there's a second thing, helping the helpers. We are putting up programs to help our volunteers get on with it, because they are volunteers and not professionals. And the last thing is we are trying to be another time a platform, a neutral platform in society to open the debate of the pros and the cons. So again, a role of mediation. So not saying this one is good and this is not good, but a role where people with fear, with angst and critics could come together and speak together. And this is a good monument. And we did a survey last year because we feared that after the first year of enthusiasm that would drop down and critics would overcome, and the majority of German public opinion favors still very strongly for our refugees program. And I think that is quite because the churches are working so well together.
Professor Einar Thomassen, this weekend you have the Oslo Symposium. a forum where the bishops of the Norwegian Church may be accused of heresy. My question to you, as we are speaking of identity, is this the Tea Party movement from the United States metastasing into our culture in Norway?
I'm not quite sure what you are getting at when you are speaking about this.
Conservative, aggressive Christianity applied on immigrants and whatnot. Family values.
Yes.
Actually,
I'm not
it's
following
it's a
what
bearing point for Donald Trump's victory.
what the bishops are saying at the moment. But as a general comment on what we have been discussing now, I think that the churches all over Europe...
Yeah, and the identity.
Yes, it's a question of identity, it's a question of values, okay? But the churches in Europe have provided a very important moral voice in the current refugee crisis. And it is able to do so, I think, because it has a basis in values that are sort of transcendent. Because it refers to, it insists that there are values that transcend the immediate material needs of human beings. I think that is a message that we need. Now, this has been done in a way which I'm sure that Martin Luther would not have recognized very well. I mean, if you look at the relationship between religion and identity, and a nation, and religion and values, I think it is probably fair to say that in the traditional Lutheran vision, the nation and Lutheranism were supposed to be coextensive. I mean, Luther did not want a religious diversity within the countries where his brand of Christianity was supposed to reign. So those who would not accept the teaching of his catechism, for instance, they should be chased out of the country. So the attitude of the churches today is dramatically different from that kind of exclusivism that was characteristic of Lutheranism in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And that has to be recognized. I think that the values of the Christian churches, or the Lutheran churches in particular these days, they have a wider reference than the more historically conditioned positions of Luther himself.
Prime Minister Erna Solberg, you are patiently waiting to comment on these things, but I will give you the word now. However, reminding you that Bishop Nordhaug said it is a Christian obligation to stand up for the refugees. Do the Norwegian bishops at large give you good guidance in this political question?
They raise their voice, and I respect that people raise their voices. I also say that it's a very difficult issue, which is very intervening into a lot of other policy issues, which of course you can just discuss how do we treat people when they come here, or we can try to address the whole migration issue. It's important to remember that we have a large migrational issue which will change Europe if we don't have policies in place that in fact halves and stops some of this migration. Africa is going to go from 1 billion people to 3 billion people 50, 60 in 2000, before 2100. And we are in a situation, if you don't get economic growth, if you don't create jobs, the movement towards our countries will become larger and larger. And they are not persecuted. They are not refugees in a traditional, conventional sense, but they are people who are seeking a better life for themselves and their children, which I think is totally respectable, because we all would have done that in the same situation. The problem we are facing is, in a way, how do we handle this as Europe? And we are struggling with finding the good ways of handling this. But I think we have to be very honest that this is a question of how will our societies change? After we have, I sometimes hear Angela Merkel on party meetings in Europe in EPP, and she says we have 15% of the people of the world, we are 25% of the economy, and we are 50% of the welfare states. We have the most elaborate welfare systems. We have the best systems to take care of people, maybe because of our background as Christians, building up big and large welfare systems where we are in solidarity to each other. It will not manage that large influx of migrants. And we have to be honest about that discussion. So I think, yes, I respect that they are arguing against some of our policies, but sometimes I will also say that then you also have to discuss the big issue. How do we in the future manage this? And the second thing, how do we manage integrational issues? It's not true that, and I think we have to, maybe to be honest, to say a lot of this discussion is not so much about when it comes to values and ideas. It's not so much about migration, because the biggest wave of migration to Norway the last years have been Catholics from Poland. In the mid-90s, the Muslims became the largest minority in Norway. 2007, the Catholics regained that position because of the movement of people in Europe. But the big issue is, of course, extremism. It's how do we manage to get inclusive societies, and how do we combat that type of extremism? It's to have not too many people who are on the outskirts of our society. That means that we have to create jobs, job opportunities. We have to do that for the population who are already here, but also for the poor people who are coming here. If not, the rise of extremism will become bigger. And then sometimes politicians have to make tough decisions, and I can always see that on moral grounds you can argue against them on every individual basis, but the sum, somebody has to take responsibility for, and the politicians are trying to do that.
Bishop Nordhaug, then when Erna Solberg was Kommunalminister, Minister of...
I was also criticized when I was responsible for migration issues,
You
so I know this.
you will not be criticized, no. You will be reminded of what you said. When she was Minister of Municipalities, Mrs. Solberg said in my studio, she did not see a particular good reason why Trondheim should become the second biggest town of Somalia. Didn't she have a point?
Well, sure, she has many points, but I think I have some too.
And the word is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are talking about Reformation, so let's think a bit about what did Luther say about politics. Well, he had more or less this doctrine of two kingdoms, and he said, here is the church, and the church has no political means, no weapons, no powers. We are preaching the word of God, and we are appealing to each man's conscience to act according to the will of God. And then, on the other hand, you have the state who has weapons, who has power, and there are Christians and non-Christians working together in the state on seeking a common ground. And the church does not seek political influence. On that, Luther was very clear, and that was, of course, against the Catholic Church, who had a lot of political influence at the time. And still, Luther was very harsh in criticizing the princes of his own time and the emperor. So we are in a good tradition here. And what I recognize is what the Prime Minister says, that this is a very big issue, and it cannot be uncontrolled. But I cannot realize why Norway, as the country in Western Europe who has maybe the most resources when it comes to social structures, financial resources, functioning democracy, that we are not... Why is your minister on immigration bragging that we have the hardest policy on this issue in Europe? Is this a goal we should follow?
At least she says, Civil Lester, that you have the most restrictive immigration policy. Do you agree with her, or do you agree with the bishop?
I've said we do not have the most restrictive policy on all issues. On some issues we have, on some others we don't. If you really link the different rules and regulations. Why do we talk about restriction? Because I'll give you a very practical example. We stopped handling Somalia cases in Norway to reschedule, to look in if you had the right decision making in 2004 on the refugee and asylum situation and security situation in Somalia. It took 24 hours before it was known at the streets of Mogadishu that Norway didn't handle this and that they were going to have a stricter policy. That's the world we are living in. So, of course, we are giving strong signals also to tell people not to come because it's difficult. A lot of people will be turned down. So some of the reasons why we have a firm policy on telling that it's difficult to get an asylum. The second thing we do is to return people back to their home countries when they have been turned down for asylum. That is because that stops people who are moving on false reasons, because there's a big industry of smugglers who are smuggling people to a better life. And on that way, people are getting beaten, raped, sometimes they die on the way, very often on false hope. And I think it's important that we are quite strong on telling people and using this also as an important information to the people who might rethink that they could leave for a better society. So sometimes you have to also understand that is part of the communication around these issues. Then I think what we really should do, and which I think is important, is to say, what can we do to stop people from moving? How can we create job opportunities, hope, less conflict in the origin of these crises? There are some large crises that we will have to take a lot of refugees in certain borders, but the large migration movement that we have is because we are not getting the development aid to function, we are not getting policies in those countries to function, we are not dealing with the conflicts on an earlier side, and I think that's the other balance that we have to have, and that is to make sure that we are giving more people help to have a better life where they're coming from. I think that will give a much better balance in the world in the future.
We must try to avoid making this an immigration debate, but Professor Woodbury, if I understand you correctly, your research showed viable examples of fruitful effects of Christians' activities in the third world. Here in Europe, obviously, as in the States, by the way, integration of immigrants and refugees is at the core. Is there any use in your science, in your research, giving advice to how we can better integrate, assimilate, whatnot, when it comes to the influx of people from the third world to Europe?
Well, I haven't studied immigration so much as I've studied.
I mean, missionaries left an heritage that was positive.
Yes, they did.
If we could influence people in the third world, why can't we influence them when they come here? You can influence people when they come here. One thing that I think is important is to allow religious freedom, both there and here. I think advocating religious freedom is important internationally, and that's something that can be done in terms of a policy, which can help stem some of the migration, partially because it influences long-term development, particularly among the poor, and also it prevents discrimination against religious minorities, which is one reason for migration. But also within a country, as long as it is I'm trying to think of the right word. In the United States, over time, groups that the people who were there before were very scared about and nervous about, for example, Catholic immigrants, and where there was sometimes violence against, or Asian immigrants. There was rules to stop Chinese and Japanese from coming from the United States, etc.
over time, a lot of those groups that people were scared about and thought would destroy our culture didn't. They've contributed it to it. And they have integrated into the society. Now, when there's huge influxes of people all at once, it tends to create a reaction by the community that is already there, which is maybe a reason for trying to moderate the amount of flow. But I also think there has to be a welcoming of people when they come, and a respect for them, which in the long term, I think, leads to less extremism and more sort of integration. So when you treat people poorly, when you look down at them and resist them and create sort of a sense of that they're unwelcome, I think that fosters groups staying separate from the dominant community. It fosters extremism because people feel like they don't belong here anyways, and you just hate me, and so then you hate back. But if you foster reaching out and getting to know people and welcoming them and integrating them into your lives, I think over time people learn from each other and you get a better society. And people have adopted over time dominant American values while keeping aspects of their own culture that are separate and which are a unique and valuable contribution to American culture. And I think that can happen here as well.
Stefan Springer, was it this bona fide attitude Angela Merkel had in mind when she, in the autumn of 2015, said, "Herzlich willkommen, ich öffne die Türe"?
I'm not a politician, and I can't say
No,
what
but
Bishop
you know your
Hoffmann
society,
said,
and there was a price to pay.
Absolutely, but that was a special situation when really there was a flux of people, refugees, and she said that here I stand, what shall we do? I think she strongly approved European that we have to have a broader solution, a European solution, either what to do with the asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, how to distribute, what rules would be apply, but also how to keep them in their homelands, what to do. But they were coming, and there was an emergency situation. And I think we churches for whom I speak, said, well, in that situation, that was the right answer, and we have to cope with it. And I think we are, after the first year, we are quite good at getting to it, but I don't think that means this will go on forever. Even churches now say, well, we accept absolutely that asylum seekers are sent back if the law, if the formalities, the procedures are gone with it. And I think you can't say at that time this sentence applies to our overall policy.
Professor Einar Thomassen, we obviously are in the middle of a discussion on the big moral challenge. When refugees come, either migrants or refugees, they want to go to Germany, presumably, Scandinavia, where the wealth is. Is this due to Max Weber and his teaching on Lutheran faith and capitalistic morality? Is that the reason for why Northwestern Europe has become the big magnet with its welfare states? Well, for these people who are seeking happiness in Europe?
Now you're asking at least two questions here, I think. The Weber thesis is actually about Calvinism and not about Lutheranism, so we have to realize that Luther himself did not have very progressive views on labor ethics and so on. And I don't think that the absolute monarchy model of state church that we got in Denmark, Norway, was very conducive to the kind of work ethic that Weber is writing about now. But it's nevertheless the case that we have developed over time, a successful society in terms of welfare benefits and the general respect of the individual in terms of human rights and so on. So these, whether they are economic or factors, or whether it's just the desire to live freely, it's difficult to say. But it's clear that for either reason, Northern Europe is an attractive magnet. But I think that but Great Britain is probably even more a magnet to most of people who want to leave their homelands. But I have things to say also about identity and integration and so on, but maybe we could leave that to another part of the discussion, or should I say what I think about this? Because integration has to do with negotiating identities. Of course, we know that an identity is a composite phenomenon. And that religion may be one part of one's identity, but national and local identities also. Now, the problem is that, as I see it from my point of view as a historian of religion, there are some religious traditions that have a tendency to lay more of a claim on a person of being the exclusive source of identity than others. This is obviously the case with Christianity and also with Islam, so that there is an inherent problem in the theologies of some of these religions against accepting a situation where religious identity is being relativized in relation to other sources of identity. But that is what we have to effect. We have to tone down the importance of religious identity in this country in order for this country to be able to exist as a religiously pluralistic society. So that will be part of my answer to some of the questions that have been raised.
Bishop Nordhaug and Prime Minister Solberg, we are observing increasing criticism against religious content in school sermons, even at Christmas time. Is this abuse of our tolerance versus people of other faiths in this society, Bishop Nordhaug?
Well, I think on this topic, the Prime Minister and I probably will agree. And that we are both in favor of keeping this tradition of school services before Christmas and also before Easter some places, because this is a part of getting to know our traditions in society.
And maybe even of the faith.
Yes, and even other faiths. And if people from other faiths come to Norway, I think they expect to meet vital Christianity. And the school shall, of course, not itself be a place for preaching the gospel. This is the task of the church. But the school will acknowledge the place that the church has with its worships and with its tradition, especially before Christmas, and let all pupils, not only the Christian pupils, but also those who have no faith, who are Muslims, invite all on equal terms to take part in that worship if they want to. But also, of course, it's important to stress that there is no force here. And if the parents of the children say that my child shall not take place in the Christian worship, of course there must be other alternatives, and this must be done properly. But I think it's not our new fellow Norwegians with another faith, say the Muslims, who are mostly against this tradition of school worships before Christmas, but it's more or less aggressive, non-believing Norwegians.
Anna Solberg, the king asked not to change his obliged membership of the church when the constitution was amended. Is this a strong signal to those who want to undermine the Christian traditions in Norway?
I think it's a strong signal that the king had a wish that should still be the regulation around those around being a king. If you have a new king who would want something else, I think that is a paragraph that will be open for revision by the Norwegian Parliament. but saying, but for the current king and his son, this is an important issue. So it will be there for a long time. I think it's more like understanding that the royal family has had a connection to the church for such a long time, and that still wanted to have that, even if you separated the church and the state. But if I can just say about religious sermons, I think we should not have preaching in Norwegian schools or in Norwegian school situations. But in nearly all other discussions about curriculum and how to learn things, we say we should see things in action. They should see how it's done. So why should you not be participating in a religious sermon to see how is this Norwegian church doing its religious sermons? And why should not my children go to a Friday preach it in a mosque to see how that is done? I mean, this is to demythicize some religious practices. And I think, and I agree with the bishop that most of parents of children with from other religions, they have very relaxed shoulders on this. But it's a battle, a political battle around these issues, especially from those who are not non-believer and their organizations. But of course, you should never force people to participate in something that they don't want to participate in when it's a religious sermon. But I mean, I have been to Hindu sermons, I have been to Buddhist temples, I've been seeing those, you do that when you're a tourist and you go on holiday and you see what they're doing. And I learned from that, my children learn from that. And I think it's part of the educational system also to participate in it. And it's a tradition, at least in this part of Norway. It's been a tradition that you have Christmas, you go to Christmas Mass, and I have very big problems with understanding why we should make this into a big discussion instead of make parents agree on this and have it and do what every school likes to do.
Stefanie Springer, Eastern Europe was under the heel of the Russians trying to create an atheist society in Eastern Europe, east of the Oder-Neisse, the Iron Curtain, for 50 years. Is this the reason, maybe, that the Christianity is so strong today in Eastern Europe, in countries like Hungary, Poland, the Protestant Baltic states, and so forth? As a reaction to atheism?
I wonder if Christianity is really so strong as you say, or this is more for political reasons.
I don't necessarily say it's good, but it's strong.
Well, yes, perhaps it is, but there are always historical reasons in Poland, but you're more an expert of Eastern Europe, I guess. But that was a bit like Ireland, always the Catholic Church, the church of suppressed people against other countries that came oppressing. And so that was quite a political role to keep an identity in a situation of foreign oppression. And perhaps it's rooted in that.
Anna Thomassen, definitely the church has been oppressive in many situations, but the last 50 years the church was oppressed. Maybe that strengthened the church.
I think a comment on this question, because the situation is not uniform in former Eastern Europe. You have some countries like Poland where Catholicism is maintaining its strength, and as it seems at the moment, it may have something to do with the fact that I had a pope at one time, but there must maybe other factors too. But in other countries like Lithuania, religion is going down very much, like in Western Europe. In other former communist countries like the Czech Republic and Slovakia and so on, religion is not really very important. So there doesn't seem to be some causal link between being oppressed by communists and now being religious. And in Yugoslavia, you probably see some of the same things going on. So this is a task for you sociologists to do a contrastive analysis of why these things are happening differently in different countries.
There is a change, and that is where nationalism is on rise in some of these former communist countries. They are going closer to having a religious identity towards that nationalism. You see it in Russia, you see it in Hungary. I mean, we shouldn't close our eyes to the fact that the church and more nationalism is moving closer in some of those countries, which is, to me, challenging aspects because
this is a dangerous development.
Mr. Solberg, the head of the Russian church has been accusing Mr. Olav Fikse, he is the Norwegian Secretary General of the World Council of Churches, that the West European churches are too lenient, too soft on family values, on sexual minorities. May he have a point when we see what happens in the Netherlands, what may happen in France. Are you so sure that this nationalism that we all find appalling is not closer to many unseen people than we think?
I think nationalism, if democracies don't deliver on development and inclusive societies for all, it's a recipe for nationalism. And it can be linked to extremism, and you can use religion as a part of that. That's what happens with fundamental Islam. That's what happens in some of the right-wing movements you see around Europe, is that they are also using systems, and they are also using the religious, not so much the religious institutions, but they are using the religious identity to be against somebody else, because and especially, of course, in Europe, against Islam. Some of the countries also against Israel and the Jews. Still, there is anti-Semitism on the rise in some countries. So there's a link between this. But I think we as politicians all around Europe have to say it's because we haven't managed to deliver societies that are inclusive enough and give hope for people. And of course, this links to stronger institutions, it links to job creation, it links to corruption, it links to elitism in some of these countries. So when you get a government in Greece that is partly from the right side and partly from the left side, which is anti-EU and anti-establishment, but they are from the both sides. It's an interesting aspect to see that it's because when they get big votes, it's because it's also a sort of that the old politicians have failed at their exam of managing to have this basis on tolerant, inclusive societies. And I think this is the really big challenge for Europe. That is, how do we manage to develop societies where people feel identity and partner that they have a future in? And if not, we will get much more of that divisive politics.
Bishop Nordhaug, I think we had a goal of holding on for 1.5 hours, and we are soon there. So my last question to you is, are there people using Christianity today as a Trojan horse for less than respectable purposes in the current society?
Well, if you take a look on our neighboring country in Denmark, it is easy to see that Christianity, by some extreme movements on the right side, are using Christianity as a barrier against refugees with a Muslim background. And that is not good. I think what we should say is that Christianity, practicing Christianity, is not insisting on that we have an exclusive position, that this country should only be for Christians and those who have other faiths should not be included. The Christianity of this country is shown in its openness towards others, on the common grounds on human rights and law of justice. This is our Christian heritage, not that we are forcing anybody to act in a certain way, like there is a tendency in some Muslim countries where you have Sharia, which is a really religiously based law upon which everyone has to be obedient. This is not our tradition. Our tradition, which is a Christian tradition, is to have an open and tolerant society. And we should not allow, and this is an obligation for the church, not allow Christianity to be used as a Trojan horse, as you say, for people with have bad intentions.
Stefan Springer, will Germany remain an open and tolerant society to the same extent as today after your elections next fall?
I hope so. Ardently.
And the hope is the last that dies. Is an open society the hallmark of Christianity, Professor Thomassen?
It was not that before, but it will have to be in the future. I mean, the pluralistic religious situation that we get now in Western Europe is actually quite unique in the religious history of Europe. It hasn't happened since the end of the Roman Empire. So it is a challenge to all countries to have to find a formula that will work for this new situation. We have to realize it's new, and we have to find some way of dealing with it.
Professor Robert Woodbury, you pay allegiance to the flag in American schools. Will American Christians make an uprising against a man with the copyright of the slogan, America First?
I don't know. I'm not a fan of Trump.
I didn't suspect you.
Lots of things have surprised me recently. I don't know what to say.
Erna Solberg, we are in the beginning of a process in this society, finally now, where the state and the church has been divided. Do you dare to look into the future and make a prognosis? Will Norway be predominantly Protestant in 20 years?
With the current speed, we will be predominantly non-religious, to be honest. I think that's the big challenge. It's not going to be predominant Islam or Muslims or other. We have a current speech. It depends a bit on how relevant the church manages to be for people. And I think that's the challenge. The fact that we had a state church for so long time have also always upheld the church in a way. It's given legitimacy to the state, but it's also made it a little bit easier to be a church. And now you have to meet. Now the church has to meet its members to be relevant. To find ways of communicating with them, getting young people to get interested in it, and I think it's, we'll see. It's a big job. It's a big job.
Bishop Nordhaug, does this mean that you have a freer hand to fight the big devil, the big enemy, the tendency towards a more secularized, secular society?
Well, I think in many ways we have a secular society in that there is no preference for any special religion in our way of governing this country. It's open for everybody. I think secularization is a good thing, in many ways also a Christian thing, because it opens up possibilities for people with different faiths and with no faiths. But there is also a bad secularization, which puts itself in a totalitarian place and says that only secularization is the right way to argue. Only atheism is the logic and consistent way of thinking. And we have to meet that with an upcoming and offensive way of arguing for our faith on common ground. We cannot claim any privileges anymore, but we have to, through our preaching, our arguments, and maybe most of all, our actions of love, that people see that this is the faith that we want to join and we want to share, and upon which ground we will build our lives. And that is all we can ask for within a secular society.
Wise words. I thank you all for your effort to enlighten us. Thank you very much. har holdt i tiden.